So as long as the West meaninglessly supports the Ukraine war and encouraging, for example, like in Ukraine, it's illegal to vote, it's illegal to not go to war if you're drafted. They actually pick up people, guys, just from the streets and pull them into cars and then off to conscription, off die in the meat grinder.
Defence officials in Ukraine have described claims of corruption within its army recruitment as shameful and unacceptable. It comes after President Zelensky recently sacked every regional recruitment head after officials were accused of taking bribes and intimidation. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse reports.
Боятися – це нормально.
It's okay to be scared.
А чего вы так хватаете за руки? Мы все снимаем, вот. Ну что это за новости? Ну, полиция приехала. Вот как у нас забирают в армию.
In this war, while everything is being blamed on Putin and Russians are being portrayed as having absolutely no own mind of their own, no agency, and that like basically the Kremlin does not exist, the West has also vilified Russians in a racist way. We have excluded them from participating in Olympian Games, we have bullied them, we have attacked the civilians in order to, like, the mentality here is that if we ostracize the Russian people, if we behave like fucking Nazis, we'll make Russia think like, oh, we must topple Putin, which will not happen. The Russians are not stupid. They didn't have Freemasonry for 250 years. So since 250 years, since that Tsar banned basically Freemasonry, there was no official Masonry, even during Soviet times. So like, although Stalin and Lenin were Freemasons, they got initiated, for example, like Stalin got initiated in France, in the Grand Orient, not in Russia. There were no lodges in Russia.
Are the Ukrainians winning, or would you say not losing the war in Ukraine?
The situation on the battlefield is extremely difficult. The Russians are now pushing on many front lines, and of course the big offensive that the Ukrainians launched last summer didn't give the results we all hoped for. And we see how Russia is now building up, how they are acquiring drones from Iran, actually building their own drone factory to produce their own drones in Tatarstan with help from Iran, how they get ammunition and ballistic missiles from North Korea. And they have also demonstrated a high tolerance for casualties. So overall, Russia is pushing hard. And this is serious, and we should not underestimate, we should never underestimate Russia.
Russians are bad. Russians are evil. After all, wasn't the Soviet Union bad and evil? This is not the Soviet Union. This country today is radically different. If anything, it is extremely religious, culturally conservative, and the Russian military has behaved extraordinarily well.
What is really going on the ground in Ukraine versus what I just read at the Times in London or what I read in the New York Times on a regular basis?
Systematically, we have lied about everything involving Russia and Ukraine now for months, if not years. Russia is by no means the evil aggressor in this thing. If anything, Russia launched an operation that it felt it had to secure its country.
This is the biggest existential threat to humankind that no one pays attention to.
Well, we can use just a tactical nuclear weapon. I always loved that. We just want to use a small weapon to make a point. This is insane. The use of any nuclear weapon, under any circumstances, it will produce Armageddon. We need to understand that. We should be grateful that Mr. Putin has turned out to be someone capable of exercising restraint. This is not someone who's given to emotion and ruled by emotion, thank God. If you look at China, they come in with lots of cash, they offer to do things and expand their relations, but they're not interested in involving themselves in the internal affairs of other societies.
The danger of complete censorship of actual killings in the war, the dangers of unilaterally and bipartisan support without any kind of realism in portraying the war is setting Europe up for complete catastrophe and eventually the USA, because let's say that Russia will win, because most likely Russia will win. What's going to happen then? And when we know they support the right wing, or the right wing supports Russia, it's rather that way around. And what if, like Germany kicks out America? Europe basically makes peace with Russia after we have, destroyed these traitors in our own governments here. Eventually, we all will know that all these wars go out from America. Eventually, Siberia will be taken, Alaska will be taken, and it should be taken. And when China, Russia, and Europe go against America, then it will be gone. It will be reverse D-Day. And I hate war, but that's the one war I will support and go myself. You had the time to revolt. You knew you had to. Because this is the result now. You will be conscripted to war. To a war that profits nobody. That is completely meaningless. And that has been started over, like pulling out all the resources out of Russia. Like Slavoj Žižek, this weird creature. What kind of weird product is he, But you will see a clip where Žižek talks again about this connection between the more conservative Europeans and Americans and Russia. And there are many reasons for this. Like, the conservatives are traditionally more interested in military history. They understand military history. They're not just like, the leftists are a bunch of faggots, to be honest. They have no idea about how to wage a war, how to estimate war, and they will gobble up any kind of propaganda that they want to hear. And without any kind of clear orientation, until the end, until Ukraine will give up, the Europeans and the Americans will think like Ukraine is winning. This is like Hitler. Like, until the end, Hitler believed in his little bunker that, that few other brigades are gonna come and they will push back the Russians and they're... No. This is delusion.
Great unholy alliance which Putin, not only Putin, is exploiting to the end. I know people who are close to Putin. And they told me that what Putin is doing is interesting. On the one hand, he relies on Orthodox Church support. The, how do you call it, patriarch or whatever of Orthodox Church in Russia, Kirill, he's an old KGB fellow of Putin, no? But not only that, Putin did something very interesting. He controls a group of young leftist Marxists, and they are the ones who support his otherwise almost openly fascist, conservative line of argumentation. You know, Western Europe is the realm of Satanism. Kirill, Patriarch, even proclaimed Putin the greatest exorcist of our time. And for example, I watched a wonderful debate on Russian TV. I follow it. You learn a lot there. About ideological madness. When somebody confronts a pro-Putin figure and says, but are you really sure that Ukrainians are degenerate Nazis? And the guy said, okay, even if you ignore all other things, they allowed a pride parade in Kiev.
There will be no military victory for Ukraine. Anybody who believes that this is possible is insane. And who believes this lies? These are mostly liberals, academians who have no understanding of military history, of military engagements, of military service themselves. They never shot a rifle. And if these people think that they will, these people are the ones who tell young people like, go die for our cause.
Well, leftists are terrified of being drafted into war. Oh, the irony, the very same young leftists that voted overwhelmingly for the warmongering, child-sniffing Joe Biden are now terrified that their man in the White House is going to draft them to go to war.
A very important thing I told my daughter and granddaughters, no serious guys till you're 30. Okay. No what? No serious guys till you're 30.
I'll keep that in mind. At least.
Let me whisper you a secret. Don't tell Mommy what I told you. You're going to have to go home and explain what would I do in the boat, okay? You ready?
Thank you so much.
Now, you getting in this picture?
Do I still hold five?
You can put it away. Pleasure to meet you.
Good. And again, please looking right here.
Okay, so tell me about you.
His wife, Holly.
Hi, Holly. How are you? Now, Holly, you come over to my side. You I want you next to me. I want you next to me. Right in the middle of me. You go right over here. Over this. Mom, you go right in the middle. Come on, Dad.
Your mom.
Okay, here you go.
And close proximity to children's faces. Here's just a few of those moments.
Yeah. You're good. Let me whisper a secret.
They're telling Biden basically on social media, go F yourself. Are they having buyer's remorse? According to Zero Hedge, over the past few weeks, searches for military draft and military draft age have been skyrocketing on Google Trends. So I confirmed this today. I went on Google Trends and to see what is the search volume right now for young people who are pretty darn concerned that they are about to be drafted. So here's the military draft age as a search query. Look at this. People searching military draft age to find out, am I going to be drafted? Look there on the right side of your screen. This huge spike.
In the ghetto. Ra-ta-ta-ta. Does this uniform make me look thick? Ah! Wait, I forgot my phone. I got a drink.
I'll give you some context before we get into the young fella. Glad you're here. Welcome back to Jameson's Travels. So, I don't know if it's a skit. It's the real army. See so many TikToks that don't make the military look good. Now, I get it. Young people are going to have fun. But if you're an employer, would you want your employee making your company look stupid? I don't know.
Water out of this? Renegade, renegade, renegade. Oh, grenade. It's fucking hot out here. Where's the AC? Let's break. Wait, I don't have my gun!
Attention! Sir, yes, sir! Private August. Yes, sir! My parents raised me a non-binary. Just how we like them, Private. Private, are you ready to die for pride parades in Kiev? Are you ready to die for our greatest ally, Private? Private, are you willing to die to maintain the sovereign state of Israel? Willing to die for the revision of sodomy laws? What about abortion, Private? Are you ready to die for abortion? Private, are you committed to spreading the United States of degeneracy?
I don't know what you can argue with this kid now, what we see with our own eyeballs, right? Would you want to send your young son to Ukraine right now? And we saw what happened 20 years in the desert. We left, come back with what? I mean, I don't even see oil being cheaper. You'd think there'd be something, right?
Putin said the West was seeking to exhaust Russia, but that could not happen. Instead, he said Russia has become one of the fastest growing economies in Europe and will continue to develop. He also sent a warning to the West after French President Emmanuel Macron said he wouldn't rule out NATO troops fighting in Ukraine.
Они должны, в конце концов, понимать, что у нас тоже есть оружие, да знают об этом. Сейчас только я сказал, тоже есть оружие, которое может поражать цели на их территории. И что все они придумывают сейчас, чем пугают весь мир, что все это реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации. Они чего, этого не понимают, что ли?
Putin also said that Moscow will be strengthening its defenses in the west of the country after Finland and Sweden joined the NATO military alliance. And he boasted about new sophisticated weapons that are now in use and on combat duty, such as the Kinzhal and Zircon missile systems. Despite his threats, Putin said that Russia is ready for talks with the United States on strategic stability, but blamed the US for seeking to defeat Russia strategically. The president said that over the past 2 years, Russian armed forces gained enormous combat experience and they will continue the operation in Ukraine until the goals are achieved. The address comes just 2 weeks before Russians go to the polls to vote for the president. Although he is expected to win comfortably in a restricted political landscape, he used the speech to make some campaign pledges. He outlined
As the war in Ukraine rages on and Russian forces escalate their attacks, French President Emmanuel Macron has urged Europe to be ready if Russia escalates. In a television interview, Macron said, if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, the credibility of Europe will be reduced to zero.
I want to say just stop the war and speak with him.
But he will ask till where you are ready to go. You're ready to sit down around the table and start negotiating?
Of course.
Okay.
We have to. Of course, we have to.
Okay. Volodymyr, as soon as I have a feedback from this side, I will do it. And let me revert to you on what we can do. I mean, for sure, very few things on the Russian side, but let me see with my people what could make sense to help on this issue.
Okay, thank you.
No, take care.
Il problema non sono la mamma e il papà, ma il problema sono i guerrafondai come Macron, che parlano di guerra.
Last week, the president took many by surprise when he refused to rule out the possibility that Western ground troops be dispatched to Ukraine. Well, that prompted President Putin to warn of a, quote, real risk of nuclear war. France 24's Clémence Valla has this report for us.
A 2.5-hour meeting that has left the French president even more politically isolated. On Thursday, President Emmanuel Macron met with the leaders of France's major political parties to discuss the need for greater support for Ukraine, and hammered home that there would be no limits to French support. As they came out, party chiefs from all sides of the political spectrum condemned the president's words as irresponsible.
Le maintien de la guerre.
The continuation of the war, the stubborn pursuit of a military course, is a dead end. It entails an extremely dangerous risk of escalation.
I reiterated the Republicans' total support for Ukraine. But on the other hand, I repeated our complete opposition to the commitment of ground troops.
Emmanuel Macron has been disavowed by all our European and NATO allies.
Last week, President Macron stunned many in Europe by refusing to rule out the dispatch of Western ground troops to Ukraine.
Putin then stopped the oligarchs who did this to Russia, fired them, shot.
Почему раньше здесь не было людей, которые способны были принимать решения? Почему здесь-то забегали все как тараканы перед самым моим приездом?
Unlike Medvedev, Putin confronted the factory owners.
Считаю, что вы сделали заложниками своих амбиций.
He saved his nation. Otherwise, the Russian women would be on the street like the Romanian women, selling up their children and their pussies in order to get by.
As to the relationship to the United States, we no longer have a relationship with Europe. We have a relationship with Romania, we have a relationship with France.
Cul-de-sac is...
The place is really Pacific for very long. I mean, neither the United States, we have constant wars, okay? Europe will, I suspect, not return to the 31 years, but it will return to humanity. They will have their wars, they will have their peace, they will live their lives. It will not be 100 million dead, but the idea of the European exceptionalism, I think, is the one suffering the first death. There will be conflict. There was conflict in Yugoslavia, and there's certainly conflict now in Ukraine. As to the relationship to the United States, we no longer have a relationship with Europe. We have a relationship with Romania, we have a relationship with France. There is no Europe to have a relationship with.
Yes, the gentleman in the fourth row over here.
Excuse me. By the way, I'm a subscriber. Is Islamic extremism really the major threat to the United States, and will it die on its own, or will it keep growing?
It is a problem to the United States. It is not an existential threat. It has to be dealt with, but it has to be dealt with proportionately. We have other foreign policy interests. So, the primordial interest of the United States, over which for a century we have fought wars, the First, Second Cold War, has been the relationship between Germany and Russia, because united they are the only force that could threaten us, and to make sure that that doesn't happen. If you're a Ukrainian, is essentially reach out to the only country that will help you, which is the United States. Last week...
Cul-de-sac is... Cul-de-sac is...
Pretty easy to build a bomb.
Cul-de-sac is...
I stood on this...
Ukraine is running out of ammunition. And Europe and America are running out of ammunition. And although maybe Russia needs to get certain kind of ballistic missiles from like North Korea and other weird countries, in the end, like, they produce so many artillery rounds per month and per year that we will in the next year not be able to, you know, like, follow their production line. Like, they have just more and they will produce more. And this is also how they will win the war, with that artillery, just like with the First World War.
The war in Ukraine has escalated into a fierce battleground where both Russia and Ukraine are relentlessly targeting each other's military equipment. This prolonged conflict has resulted in the destruction of numerous tanks, leading to Ukraine being dubbed the tank graveyard. Amidst this, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation recently announced that a T-72B3 tank had destroyed an American-supplied M1 Abrams tank in Ukraine. This incident reportedly occurred near Avdiivka, with the Russian ministry spokesperson claiming that the T-72B3 achieved this feat with the first shot. Notably, this is not the first time this particular T-72B3 tank has been involved in such an event. It is actually the third time it has been destroyed. However, this is the first documented instance of a US-supplied tank being destroyed by a Russian tank in direct combat. This makes us wonder, how did the Russian tanks manage to eliminate the US-supplied tank in just one shot?
It's something that, frankly, I was completely unprepared for. I've never seen anything quite like this, where systematically we have lied about everything involving Russia and Ukraine now for months, if not years. And the truth of the matter is that people have never been told or not being told, and you can find the truth, but you've got to look for it, obviously, on the internet, is that Russia is by no means the evil aggressor in this thing. If anything, Russia launched an operation that it felt it had to secure its country. We have been working tirelessly for at least the last 20 years to undermine and weaken Russia in whatever way possible. We decided we didn't care much for Mr. Putin and his success at essentially retrieving Russia from the ash heap of history. And then the Russians made it very clear that they would not accept NATO on its borders. I mean, effectively, they'd done that with Latvia and Estonia. They do have a border up there, but they made it very clear that Ukraine, which is roughly the size of Texas and the United States, could never be a member of NATO, that simply presented too much of a danger. They made that clear in 2008 at Budapest. We ignored it. And then subsequently, Mr. Putin has given speeches reiterating the criticality of neutrality for Ukraine, unwilling to see NATO bases there. In 2014, one of the principal reasons that he intervened to seize Crimea was to prevent that naval base from falling into the hands of what he expected would be NATO forces. And remember, whatever he says NATO, he ultimately means the United States. It's the United States Navy that would have gone into the ports in Crimea. It's the United States Armed Forces that is moving eastward towards the Russian border. And we've chosen not to discuss that. 2014, you also had this coup that we helped to organize and implement, which put people in power that otherwise would never have gotten there. And these people were violently anti-Russian, hostile to Russian national security interests. We encouraged that. We cultivated it. We began pouring money into this thing called the Ukrainian army. Really, it's more the army than anything else. And in 2014, this fledgling Ukrainian army began immediately attacking the Russians in eastern Ukraine, in the so-called provinces or oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in the time between the first attacks by artillery in 2014 and the intervention by the Russians in February of 2022, they killed 14,000 people. And they fired thousands and thousands of rounds of artillery. In fact, in the week or two just before the Russians finally moved in, they fired over 2,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. And these were all being fired at Russian civilians.
Instead of howling with the wolves, what we should do is we should take a serious look at the last 50, 70 years of American war history, here together with Daniele Ganze, and contemplate all the wars, the illegal wars that America has waged from the end of Second World War up to now. America is a constant state of war. They supply countless wars right now, and in some of these wars they actually have their troops there. And if they don't have their troops there, then they have psychological warfare battalions and their fucking CIA everywhere. And this will bite them worse back than the Germans. In fact, you know, like the CIA was founded basically on principles that were laid out by the Nazi Party after German capitulation.
1948 manipuliert die CIA die Wahlen in Italien. Das darf man nicht. Haben sie aber gemacht. Imperiale Politik. 1950 bombardieren die USA Nordkorea. 1953 stürzen die USA im Iran die Regierung. Das darf man nicht. 1954 stürzen die Regierung in Guatemala.
Thank you very much for allowing us to see this exhibit of communism in Guatemala. You're welcome.
Dann geht es weiter. 1961 versuchen sie, die Regierung in Kuba zu stürzen, die Schweinebucht-Invasion. Es funktioniert nicht.
Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead.
1964 beginnen sie Vietnam zu bombardieren und sagen, die Vietnamesen haben angefangen, der sogenannte Gulf of Tonkin-Zwischenfall, von dem wir heute genau beweisen können, nein, den hat es nicht gegeben, die Amerikaner haben gelogen. Das führt zu 11 Jahren Krieg und 3 Millionen Toten. Also wir sprechen nicht über Details. 1964 bis 1975 ist dieser Vietnamkrieg. 1973, am 11. September übrigens, stürzen sie die Regierung von Allende in Chile und installieren Pinochet, den Diktator. Der Pinochet nimmt die Opposition ins Flugzeug, fliegt über den Pazifik und wirft sie dort ab. Das ist Terror. Das verhindert bei den Familien, bei den Müttern, bei den Geschwistern, dass sie abschließen können vor dem Grab, weil sie hoffen immer, dass ihre Kinder noch zurückkehren. Das bricht die Bevölkerung. Das ist 1973. Das geht weiter. 1979 unterstützt die CIA die Mujahedin in Afghanistan.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Die ganzen 80er Jahre lang werden radikale Muslime in Afghanistan bewaffnet. Durch Saudi-Arabien und die USA. Warum? Man will die Sowjetunion in Afghanistan in eine Niederlage hineinbringen, beliefert die Mujahedin, auch Osama Bin Laden, Al-Qaida, mit sogenannten Stinger-Waffen. Und mit Stinger-Waffen können dann die Afghanen die Russen abschießen mit ihren Helikoptern und dann verlieren die Russen den Krieg in Afghanistan. Es funktioniert, ich sage nicht, dass es funktioniert hat. Zuvor, noch 1979, hilft man Saddam Hussein an die Macht.
Saddam Hussein geht zur Bühne und tritt ans Podium. Sein Ziel? Die Säuberung der Partei von allen, die ihm auch nur im geringsten gefährlich werden können. Er verkündet, es gibt Verräter in unseren Reihen und beginnt eine Liste mit Namen zu verlesen.
Einige Dutzend Männer wurden bei der Versammlung aus dem Saal geführt. Nur wenige kamen je zurück.
Unterstützt Saddam Hussein 1980, als er Khomeini angreift. Dann hat man den Krieg zwischen dem Iran und dem Irak. Ja, der Irak fängt an, Saddam greift an, aber ganz still unterstützt man Saddam Hussein. Damals war er der Freund des Westens. Warum? Weil man möchte den Iran schwächen. Also 80 bis 88 dieser Krieg. Und in der Iran-Contra-Affäre 1986 wird aufgedeckt, dass das Imperium gleichzeitig noch den Iran bewaffnet hat. Weil das nicht abgefahren ist. Beide Seiten bewaffnen, weil dann schlachten sie sich noch besser ab. Georg Friedmann hat gesagt, amerikanischer Geostratege, man sollte die Deutschen und die Russen gegeneinander hetzen. Wenn die sich gegenseitig töten und sich das deutsche und das russische Blut vermengt, ist das ein Vorteil für das US-Imperium. Diese Dinge wurden gesagt. Man muss sie zur Kenntnis nehmen. Und darum ist es sehr wichtig, dass Deutschland die Freundschaft zu Russland pflegt. Das ist wirklich wichtig. (1986) bombardiert man Libyen. Ja, Ronald Reagan bombardiert Libyen 1986.
7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activity.
1990 marschiert Saddam Hussein in Kuwait ein, im August 1990. April Glaspie, die amerikanische Botschafterin, sagt ihm zuvor, die Amerikaner hätten nichts dagegen, wenn er seine internationalen Probleme so löst, wie er das für richtig hält. Als er aber einmarschiert, sagt man sofort, das geht ja gar nicht. Der UNO-Sicherheitsrat verhängt ein Embargo. Es gibt einen Krieg, Operation Desert Storm, die Amerikaner bombardieren Irak und Kuwait 1991. Die Grünen sagen, nie Krieg etc. Und dann Joschka Fischer und Schröder machen 1999 mit dem amerikanischen Imperium mit und bombardieren Serbien. Völlig illegal, ein illegaler Angriffskrieg.
Liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger, heute Abend hat die NATO mit Luftschlägen gegen militärische Ziele in Jugoslawien begonnen.
Und es wird mit dem Trauma der Deutschen gearbeitet, dass die Regierung nämlich behauptet, es gebe Konzentrationslager in Serbien, was nicht wahr war, aber was natürlich in der deutschen Bevölkerung diesen Schockeffekt ausgelöst hat. Und dann hat man ohne UNO-Mandat, ist man plötzlich wieder im Krieg, unter Rot-Grün.
Judgment, an independent expose, reveals how a British film crew photographed a Bosnian emergency shelter to look like a Nazi concentration camp.
Ja, das haben viele bis heute noch nicht richtig verarbeitet, ich vielleicht auch nicht, aber so ist es. Dann kommt 2001. 2001 kommen die Terroranschläge vom 11. September, die bis heute nicht geklärt sind. Und während diesen Terroranschlägen wird das US-Imperium so, dass es sagt, die neue Rahmenerzählung ist, der Krieg gegen den Terror erlaubt uns alle Kriege zu führen, die wir wollen. Okay, in diesem Zustand sind wir jetzt. Ja, wir sind immer im sogenannten Krieg gegen den Terrorismus. Aber ich kann allen Menschen, die jung sind, dann kann ich ihnen nur sagen, lehnen Sie den Krieg gegen den Terrorismus ab. Er ist durchsetzt mit Lüge und Gewalt.
There are no cars in this community at all.
Isn't it great?
Cul-de-sac is the first community in the U.S. designed and built specifically for car-free living. Co-founder Ryan Johnson says the demand is strong.
Every
cul-de-sac is
really not that long ago, as I say. We owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well.
Cul-de-sac is...
If it said it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, then that was a fact. Nowadays, people can go to all sorts of different sources for the news, and they're much more questioning about what we're saying. So it's no longer good enough for us just to say, this is what happened, or this is the news. We have to explain our working.
There is no consensus today to send ground troops in an official, endorsed and sanctioned manner, but in dynamic terms, nothing should be ruled out. We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war.
Emmanuel Macron speaking there. We can now bring in our international affairs editor, Angela Diffley. Angela, good afternoon. One after another, we've had some European states coming out and saying, no, not us. But we also had a reaction coming from Moscow saying that if we had NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, this would be an escalation.
Yes. Jens Stoltenberg has also come out very clearly and said there will be no NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. That would require the unanimous agreement of all NATO members. That is not going to happen. That will not happen. What what Emmanuel Macron is referring to is possible bilateral agreements where individual countries will agree to send troops. As you say, a number of them have already ruled out that possibility. Joe Biden said right at the outset of this war, American troops are not going to Ukraine. They will not go to Ukraine. And given the difficulties Washington is having in getting that $60 billion worth of aid through Congress, it would be a massively unpopular move in an election year. That is pretty much almost certainly unlikely to happen. France has, Macron has said very clearly, I maintain a position of strategic ambiguity, and so not ruling it in, not talking about how likely it might be. We haven't heard specifically from the United Kingdom yet. That is another possibility.
The war's brutality has also exposed a growing rift between the United States and Ukraine in terms of their divergent strategic approach. And our next report tells you about the vulnerabilities and the cracks that have opened up in the American-Ukrainian alliance in this war effort. Take a look.
History is literally watching. History is watching. If the United States walks away, it will put Ukraine at risk. Europe is at risk. The free world will be at risk, emboldening others to do what they wish to do us harm. My message to President Putin, who I've known for a long time, is simple. We will not walk away. We will not bow down. I will not bow down.
An absolute shocking turn of events, US and EU officials are now quietly talking with the Ukrainian government to shift strategies and broker a deal with Russia to officially end the war. According to NBC News, these conversations have included very broad outlines of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal with Russia. Just look at the incredible reversal from Time magazine, who last year named Zelensky the 2022 Person of the Year. But much like public sentiment across Western countries has changed, Time magazine now reports the situation as the lonely fight of Volodymyr Zelensky. Inside the article, it states Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies, and goes on to quote one of Zelensky's advisors who has this to say about the Ukrainian president. He deludes himself. We are out of options. We're not winning. But try telling him that. This is the beginning of the end for Ukraine, and as I'll explain in today's video, we will look back on this failure for the US and NATO as a defining moment when the world moved away from American hegemony and officially shifted to a multipolar world. Let me explain. For the past 2 years, the US government has pledged hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. We've donated so many weapons that we've depleted our own ammunition reserves, and we've convinced every Western ally to join the American-led sanctions against Russia. For the better part of 2 years, we've heard nothing from Western media other than Ukraine is winning, Putin is losing, the Russian economy is on the verge of collapsing, but the reality couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, the vast majority of the world refused to join Russian sanctions. Over 100 countries around the globe, including the world's largest democracy, India, have not sanctioned Russia. Why? Because sanctions never work, and Russia is too important of a supplier for energy resources. Before the war, India imported less than 3% of crude oil from Russia. Fast forward to today, and India buys more than 40% of crude oil from Russia. Even the United States, who ironically led the charge to force sanctions on Russia, is still doing business with Putin's government. According to the New York Times, American companies are paying around $1 billion a year to Russia's state-owned nuclear agency to buy the fuel that generates more than half of the United States' emissions-free energy. The Russian ruble has recovered to its pre-war exchange rate against the dollar, and most significantly, Russia has positioned itself to endure this war for however long it takes. Over the past few months, we've seen a significant shift from US senior officials, who have started to use the word stalemate to describe the word in Ukraine. Just listen to this clip from Senator Josh Hawley after Zelensky traveled to Washington, D.C. and asked the U.S. Congress for additional funding.
That in the words of President Zelensky, the conflict is a total stalemate. That's what he said. Totally frozen, I believe, was what his words were. Which is also what the administration told us yesterday. The administration told us yesterday they want to spend $100 billion more, our money, more, over the next year in the hopes that it will remain a stalemate. Which leads me to ask, what is the goal here for the United States? I mean, what is it this administration wants to do? I have no earthly idea. They used to say victory, victory, victory. Now it's stalemate forever. In fact, yesterday Milley said there will be no military victory.
Essentially, the war in Ukraine has come down to one simple question. Which side can maintain a military force the longest? According to the NBC article, manpower is at the top of the administration's concerns right now. The US and its allies can provide Ukraine with weaponry, but if they don't have competent forces to use them, it doesn't do a lot of good. Ukraine simply doesn't have enough manpower to win this war against Russia. And with a larger and more important war in the Middle East escalating every day, Zelensky is left with the harsh reality of the situation. Israel is a much more important ally for the United States than Ukraine ever was. Sure, the US was happy to support Ukraine when it was the only major conflict happening in the world. According to US officials, supporting Ukraine was a good investment. The US could weaken one of its largest adversaries in Russia and do so without risking any American lives.
...2014 fängt der Ukraine-Krieg an. Ja? Und da wieder die Amerikaner sagen, ja, das ist Putins Schuld. Der ist irgendeines Morgens aufgestanden und hat gesagt, jetzt kralle ich mir die Krim. Ja? Aber ja, so steht es bei Ihnen in den Zeitungen. Ja? So war es aber nicht. So war es nicht. Es war eine verdeckte Operation, die darauf abzielte, die Ukraine eine andere Regierung zu verpassen, damit eine neue Regierung die Ukraine in die NATO hineinzieht. Ja. Es gab einen Putsch.
Die Amerikaner haben insgesamt $5 Milliarden in den Umsturz in der Ukraine investiert.
Ja, ja, sagt Putin.
Nein, Victoria Nuland.
Fuck you.
Fuck the EU.
Ja. Und die Russen haben auf diesen Putsch reagiert und sich ihren Stützpunkt auf der Schwarzmeerflotte gesichert, indem sie dort eine Abstimmung durchgeführt haben. Dann kam es zur Sezession der Krim. Natürlich können wir das noch lange weitermachen, aber sehen Sie, der amerikanische Imperialismus, und hier nehme ich nur ein paar Fakten, ich habe überhaupt nicht alles erwähnt, über Agent Orange habe ich noch gar nicht gesprochen, es gibt noch viele andere, Hiroshima, Nagasaki habe ich nicht erwähnt, hat Herr Drewermann schon gesagt, aber wir sprechen hier nicht über ein kleines Problem, sondern wir haben ganz massive Gewaltprobleme mit dem amerikanischen Imperialismus. Obama, der völlig zu Unrecht den Friedensnobelpreis erhalten hat, Obama hat im Jahr 2016 insgesamt 7 Länder bombardiert. Das muss man sich mal vorstellen. Bombardiert wurden 2016 Afghanistan, Pakistan, Jemen, Irak, Somalia, Syrien und Libyen. Sagt man, ja, das sind ja alles muslimische Länder, macht doch nichts. Terroristen. Ja? So läuft die Indoktrination.
I'm Afshin Ratansi and welcome back to Going Underground, broadcasting all around the world from the UAE. It's been a week since President Vladimir Putin was re-elected by the Russian people in a landslide victory, but that hasn't stopped US President Biden and his Washington proxy nations in NATO continuing to arm a Zelensky in Kiev who has outlawed elections in Ukraine. Not only that, but Zelensky has made peace talks illegal. And then, last week, after nuclear warnings from Putin, Russia claimed that surveillance had revealed President Macron plans to deploy 2,000 French soldiers to kill Russians, in addition to innumerable UK troops already in Ukraine, revealed in an intercepted German military phone call. They probably don't remember that it was 41 years ago this month that US President Ronald Reagan, who successfully helped to destroy the USSR, proposed his never-implemented Star Wars space-based missile system. Someone who will is Reagan's Assistant Secretary of Defense, who in post administered about 70% of the US defense budget. Dr. Larry Korb is now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he joins me now from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Dr. Korb, for coming on. So, Putin congratulated, 87% of the vote, congratulated by China, India, the whole of the global south, the international community. I mean, given the US think tanks even concede that Putin is clearly popular in Russia, in your experience during the Reagan administration, could you ever imagine that there'd be no communication seemingly between Blinken and his counterpart, between Biden and Putin, because that's what they're saying right now?
No, particularly toward the end of the Reagan administration, or I should say in his second term, he was visiting with the Russians. We had contact with the Russians on a lot of areas, and particularly when Reagan developed what we call Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. A lot of us knew that it was, it was very, very difficult strategically for that to happen, or conceptually, but the Russians believed it. The Russians believed that if we were to do that and spend this type of money, that there must be something to it, even though most experts, that's new. We very rarely get 100% of people who agree on everything because we're such a diverse country. What Biden is doing, first of all, the priority.
Gaza genocide. He's bombing Yemen as we speak. He's continuing what's happening in Haiti after President Obama overthrew the government.
Of being able to use nuclear weapons if, heaven forbid, it should come to that. So Putin can talk a lot, but our nuclear arsenal is going to be much better than his because he doesn't have the money to do what he needs to do given the Russian economy.
Dr. Larry Korb, I'll stop you there. More from the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense after this break. Welcome back to Going Underground. I'm still here with Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and former U.S. Assistant Defense Secretary, Dr. Larry Korb. Dr. Korb, we were talking about the advance in nuclear technology in the United States prepared over the next decade. Arguably that, it's going to have to be sooner than that if you hear voices even in the policy think tanks of Moscow. Do you think in this election year, Joe Biden is clearly willing to pursue the $60 billion which Congress has been holding up to pour into Zelensky's accounts? He's clearly continuing in the South China Sea with China. He's supporting the bombing of Syria and Iraq because of the Gaza genocide. He's bombing Yemen as we speak. He's continuing what's happening in Haiti after President Obama overthrew the government there. And he's fighting underground, who knows, in West Africa with Mali and Burkina Faso. How many wars is he going to create in an election year? What is this defense posture? And can you understand why Trump at every rally talks about peace rather than war as the future?
Well, I certainly can't understand. What Biden is doing, first of all, the priority he's giving in the money he spends in our defense budget, which is close to $1 trillion.
You've opposed it in the past. I should just interrupt there. The amounts.
the amount we spend annually on national security is about $1 trillion now, the direction we're going. And basically, the main thing of the normal or the defense budget basically is to deal with China. These other things that you talked about that we're spending on, that comes over and above the regular budget. The $60 billion will not come out of the normal defense budget, nor will the $14 billion that's targeted for Israel. We have forces deployed in the Middle East. We've had them in Europe. And the whole situation in Haiti, we just sent the Marines back there to protect people in the embassy. Our problem is going to be dealing with the Haitian refugees that are going to try and come by boat to the United States. And some of the southern governors are not happy about that. But by and large, if you take a look at the percentage of the gross domestic product or GDP that goes to defense, it's about 3%. During the Cold War, it was 6%. And as a result of what Putin has done, the Europeans have finally met the 2% of GDP that Trump used to say was a reason for us to stop supporting NATO because they weren't meeting it. Well, they're meeting it now.
The Washington elite has lost its mind, especially as it regards this war in Russia and Ukraine and what the United States is going to do about it. They have completely lost touch with reality. And I'm being pretty strong about this because you're going to see about this, the consequences and the cost is getting real high. Now I'm standing here at Penn Station in New York City because later on today, I'm going to be having a debate with some of these Washington elites, some former secretaries of state, along with our friend John Mearsheimer. And we're going to be laying out the rational policy, the one that's based on reality, and they're going to be pitching the other side. It's going to be on the Council of Foreign Relations. It'll be available to the public sometime in mid-April. We'll let you know how that is. But it is really hard to understand how, given the facts as we see them, that so many continue to cling to this just outright fiction that can't be sustained by the reality on the ground. And I'm going to show you exactly what we're talking about here. Earlier today, I saw this while I was on the train coming up here. There's a piece in the Washington Post by Robert Kagan that basically says, hey, well, it doesn't basically, it says right there, Trump anti-Ukraine view dates back to the 1930s, and America rejected it. Will they now? Now, going into that story there, if you go into the article, a lot of the things he says are just plain crazy. It's ironic because he starts off, it's a very lengthy article, actually. He starts off by saying, talking about the conditions that were in 1930. He's basically saying the America's neutrality status before the war, many wanted isolationism. They called it America First. He's trying to draw a direct parallel to that and say that they were disastrously wrong then and they're disastrously wrong now. Then he does something kind of odd and he paints this picture which actually shows that there are some dramatic differences globally between that situation and this situation, though he tries to make them somehow the same. So, for example, he talks about how Hitler had just rolled over most of Europe. So about 9 months from September 1939 until about June 1940, Hitler rolled over Poland, France, and all the way to the English coast and had the significant amount of Europe under his control. It was right up across the British Islands and where the British Army actually escaped to Dunkirk, or over Dunkirk is a very famous battle there. And so then he's saying, we took a while before we actually got into the war, and then says, isolation. Then he draws this very long historical document that shows, how all that actually transpired. And while much of that is accurate in terms of what happened, it's what he doesn't tell you that is so crucial to this one, because he's trying to tell you that Trump's, what he claims is isolation, is analogous to that, and the consequences could be just as severe here. And that is where he falls horribly flat. So, for example, he talks about, all what Hitler had done here. And by the end of June 1940, he was at the English Channel and owned most of Europe. But what he doesn't tell you is that the analog, what he's basically trying to draw Hitler to Putin, is that Putin has, after 2 years and 1 month, so 9 months, Hitler had the most of Europe. After 9 months, Putin has 17% of one country on its border, and that's it. Hitler didn't have nuclear weapons. Putin has nuclear weapons. That's a little different from 1940. Hitler had, at the end of that time, a continental army and a massive land army, air force, huge air force at the time, navy, and an industrial capacity that could make good on his declared continental aspirations, which, of course, then he tried to go into take Russia as well as the Soviet Union at the time. So all of those things were true. That's exactly what happened then. What about today? What about Putin? Does he have continental aspirations? To the contrary, he does not. Neither does he have the capacity. Even if he wanted to do that, as I've told you many times, he doesn't have the capacity at all. And he doesn't need to attack us because he does have nuclear weapons. NATO has nuclear weapons. And that would have radically changed the outcome in 1940 if both sides' alliances had nuclear weapons. But they didn't. So that's why that situation is not analogous to what's going on here. But the Washington elite doesn't want to make that play. It doesn't want to make that now a connection to reality. That is just mind-boggling. And let's see, because at the heart of Kagan's argument, and really most of elite Washington, they want you to believe that a neo-Fuhrer in Putin is going to come rolling across the plains of Europe again, just like Hitler, the first one, did back in 1940, 1945. You're going to have another major war, and the United States is going to have to get in it. That's the play. We will have to fight in there. And you've probably heard that many times on regular news channels and certainly on ours. But is that true? Is
the end of this year, and this is, by the way, concurrent with what's going on in Europe, they're also in high gear trying to kick into gear their production, getting them distributed down to the gun line so that they can start shooting. That's not the case. Already, the West in general is cranking into high gear as fast as they can. There's already money for this part here. There's no one's waiting for money to move this forward. But as I pointed out in the show a couple of days ago, the best that the West is shooting for right now by the end of the year, the end of this year, and this is, by the way, concurrent with what's going on in Europe, they're also in high gear trying to kick into gear their production and creating new capacity. They expect to produce about 1.4 million shells by the end of this calendar year. Russia is on pace on their own to produce 4.5 million shells on their own. The point being that Ukraine and even the total West altogether is going to be chasing an uphill battle because Russia also is going to continue to expand their capacity. So at the end of the year, you're still going to be 4-1 behind in production alone. That's on top of whatever they're getting from other sources, the Russians are. And we know that both North Korea and Iran are both providing stuff as well. So they're
together. We have to make the force that has gone mad come back to the rules and make the rules work again to shield the world order of fragility. Without the rules limiting the force, it goes mad, and it is what happened with Russia. The world needs a balance between force and rules. And this is what Ukraine proposes. This is the essential core of our peace formula.
Выборы показали, что Россия сегодня одна большая, дружная семья. Идем вместе по избранному нами историческому пути. Уверены в себе, в своих силах и своем будущем.
Now, I notice I say Russian civilians. They were technically Ukrainian citizens. They just happened to be Russians. And of course, these Russians were being oppressed. They were effectively presented with a fait accompli. Either you become Ukrainian, you stop speaking Russian, you speak Ukrainian, you write in Ukrainian, and you adopt Ukrainian identity and culture and so forth, or we're going to punish you. And so the Russians in eastern Ukraine have been second or third class citizens now for years. All of this did not go down well in Russia, as you can imagine. And then, of course, we had this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was in theory presented to the Russians as a way to get past the conflict and maintain some measure of civility and peace in Ukraine. Well, it didn't work, and it didn't work, as we've discovered, because first Chancellor Merkel, who's now retired, and then subsequently Mr. Macron, the president of France, both admitted the whole thing was a hoax. It was simply a device to buy time for the Ukrainians to build their forces up. And it became very clear to the Russians that this large force, which was extremely well equipped and I would argue reasonably well trained, certainly by NATO standards, was poised to launch an attack at Russia with the goal of crushing the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk and then ultimately retaking Crimea. So the Russians said, no, thank you. And they intervened. The big mistake they made is that they assumed that someone was willing to negotiate with them. And so they went in with a really small force, no more than 90,000 on the ground in terms of combat troops. And they discovered after 2 or 3 months, 4 months, even though they were not taking heavy casualties as originally reported, they took very light casualties. It was the Ukrainians that had begun taking heavy casualties almost from the beginning. They discovered that they weren't going to get a negotiated settlement. Finally, the generals met with Putin last summer and said, this is a war. This is not what we bargained for. We miscalculated. The underlying assumptions were wrong. There is no one to talk to. And you'll recall that shortly after your former prime minister's visit in April to Mr. Zelensky, that any hope of talks was crushed. And ultimately, they said, we've got to get ready for a real war. That meant mobilizing reserves, expanding the size of the army, training everybody up, re-equipping people, because the equipment they used initially was almost all obsolescent. So that was completed by Christmas. Then there was pressure to launch an offensive, but the weather didn't cooperate, so the decision was made, since we don't have firm ground, and you recall that in that part of the world, you have this thing called the Rasputitsa, which is effectively a sea of mud that makes it virtually impassable for armored fighting vehicles or wheeled vehicles. If you leave the hard surface road, you're in big trouble. If you go back to World War II, you find that the major offensives were either launched in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen, or they were launched in June, July, August, September timeframe. So the Russians then said, fine, we'll build an impregnable defense, hold what we've got, and invite the Ukrainians to attack us. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians have taken terrible, terrible losses. And these losses have never been truthfully reported in the Western media, because I think Washington was very concerned that if it became clear that the Ukrainians were dying at great numbers, their forces were being destroyed almost faster than they could be fielded, that support for this insane notion of waging a proxy war on the backs of the Ukrainian people against Russia would no longer be supported in NATO.
Bei aller Betrachtung dieses Konfliktes versuchen, ein neutrales Bild davon zu gewinnen, nicht den bösen Iwan, der hier die Welt überrennt, sondern zu sehen, dass hier zwei Supermächte, USA und, eine inzwischen kleinere Macht, Russland, versuchen, ihre Interessensphären auszuweiten und das mit sehr aggressiven Mitteln. Nur dummerweise tun sie das in unserem Bereich mit Mitteln, die zu kriegerischen Auseinandersetzungen in unserem Territorium führen. Und die Amerikaner führen hier eine sehr, sehr langwierige geostrategische Agenda durch, die schon viele, viele Jahre alt ist und die jetzt hier in diesen Konflikt gipfelt, und es war vor Jahren bereits absehbar.
Herr Frey, jetzt haben viele Österreicher das Gefühl, dass wir hier am Gängelband der USA stehen und mit diesen Sanktionen gegen Russland, mit dem harten Vorgehen gegen Putin eigentlich deren Interessen und nicht unsere eigenen verfolgen.
Die USA spielen eine Nebenrolle in diesem ganzen Konflikt. Das ist ein Konflikt zwischen Europa und Russland. Es ist ein Konflikt über die Länder dazwischen, ein Land wie die Ukraine, wo die Menschen einfach selbst gesagt haben, sie haben nach Osten geschaut und dann nach Polen geschaut und gesagt haben, wir möchten zu dem Europa gehören. Und als sie das ausgedrückt haben, es war ein chaotischer Volksaufstand, gefolgt von demokratischen Wahlen. Als sie das gesagt haben, das wollen wir, hat Nachbar Russland, der dieses Europa, das liberale, das offene, das demokratische, marktwirtschaftliche Europa ablehnt, weil er auch seine eigene Macht dadurch bedroht sieht, hat er zu militärischen Mitteln gegriffen und einfach seinen Nachbarstaat angegriffen, Gebiete okkupiert und damit nicht nur die Ukraine beginnt er zu zerstören, sondern auch Europa, diese EU, mit all ihren Werten, mit all diesen Stärken massiv herauszufordern. Und darauf muss Europa natürlich reagieren. Und das dann zu sagen, das sind irgendwie die USA haben dort keine Interessen, die USA haben, Herr Müller, die USA haben keine, die USA wollen, die haben keine bedeutende Rolle. Das ist ein europäischer Konflikt und den muss Europa führen.
Bei der NATO sein. Frage, machen Sie Kabarett oder meinen Sie das ernst?
Herr Müller,
Sie meinen es ernst, was Sie gerade sagen, oder?
Ja, ich meine
Die
jedes
Amerikaner
Wort
haben kein Interesse in der Ukraine.
Sie können Witze machen.
Generalleutnant Ingo Gerhards, gemeinsam mit dem Leiter der Einsatzabteilung des Luftwaffenkommandos Brigadegeneral Frank Gräfe und weiteren Mitarbeitern der Flugbetriebs- und Informationszentrale der Bundeswehr offen über die deutsche Beteiligung an ukrainischen Angriffen auf russische Infrastruktur. Oberthema war die Lieferung von Taurus-Marschflugkörpern an Kiew und wie diese eingesetzt werden können, unter direkter oder versteckter Beteiligung von Bundeswehrangehörigen. So berichtete Oberstleutnant Sebastian Florstedt über die von ihm entworfenen Pläne zum Angriff auf die Krimbrücke mit Taurus-Marschflugkörpern.
Ich habe mir überlegt, was das Alleinstellungsmerkmal gegenüber jetzt den Storm Shadows und sowie Air Defense, Robustheit und Flughöhe etc. Und da komme ich dann drauf, dass es so zwei interessante Target-Types gibt. Einmal so eine Brücke im Osten und einmal Moon-Depots, wo wir reinkommen. So, und die Brücke im Osten ist halt schwer zu erreichen und die Pfeiler sind relativ klein und das kann halt der Taurus darstellen und die Moon-Depots, da kommen wir halt durch. Wenn ich das jetzt berücksichtige und vergleiche, wie viele Storm Shadows und Mauls abgeschossen wurden und haben, hat man da ein ganz cooles Alleinstellungsmerkmal. Und da habe ich mir so 3 Routen rausgesucht, wo ich sagen würde, geht es um die Brücke oder geht es um Moon Depot? Ist es reachable mit den Current Cats, die Red Erste haben und der Own Patriot? Und dann komme ich quasi zu dem Entschluss, ist grundsätzlich machbar.
Rückendeckung bekommt Florstedt von seinen Kameraden Oberstleutnant Udo Fenske und Generalleutnant Ingo Gerhards.
Ja, ich kann noch mal schnell ergänzen wegen der Brücke, weil wir die uns intensiv angeguckt haben und die Brücke ist leider aufgrund ihrer Größe wie ein Flugplatz. Das heißt, es kann durchaus sein, dass ich dafür 10 oder 20 Flugkörper brauche.
Das ist 12 geschätzt, wenn es da, wo sie aufklappt, wenn du die Pfeiler nimmst.
Ja, und selbst der Pfeiler, da machen wir unter Umständen nur ein Loch rein und dann stehen wir da. Ja. Also, ich sag mal, um da eine valide Aussage zu haben, müssten wir es wirklich selber mal...
Das bringt es ja schon ganz gut auf den Punkt. Wir alle wissen ja, dass sie die Brücke rausnehmen wollen. Das ist klar, wissen wir auch, was das am Ende bedeutet. Dann ist die Versorgung dieser so wichtig, nicht nur militärisch strategisch wichtig, auch so ein bisschen politisch ist die gute Insel da ja ihr Herzstück.
The decision has come after President Joe Biden had publicly said that he did not think that Ukraine needed the F-16s earlier in the year.
First, if they do supply F-16s, they're talking about this and are training pilots. I think you understand that very well, better than most. This will not change the situation on the battlefield, and we will destroy the aircraft just as we destroy tanks now, as well as armored vehicles and other equipment, including multiple rocket launchers.
The Russian forces have been increasingly deploying guided bombs dropped from fighter jets to pound Ukrainian positions along the front line, effectively obliterating parts of cities such as Avdiivka, which the Russian forces managed to capture earlier this year.
Russische Medien veröffentlichen einen Tonmitschnitt, in dem angeblich ranghohe Luftwaffenoffiziere über einen Einsatz dieser Waffen auf der Krim diskutieren sollen. Also es geht vor allem um Taurus in dieser Tondatei. Wir gehen durch diese Tondatei. Ich habe sie mir komplett angehört, sind knapp 40 Minuten und ich werde euch spannende Stellen davon zeigen. Es ist schon ein Hammer. Ich glaube, so etwas habe ich jetzt noch nie gehört im Zusammenhang mit der Ukraine, dass Deutschland so gut abgehört werden konnte und die Pläne durchaus im Detail hier an die Öffentlichkeit gekommen sind. So sieht die Tonnachricht aus, wie die Russen es veröffentlicht haben, mit dem Brigadegeneral Frank Gräfe, das ist der Abteilungsleiter Brigadegeneral für Einsätze und Übungen im Kommando Luftwaffe Berlin, und Ingo Harz. Ingo Harz können wir hier nochmal nachlesen, direkt in Wikipedia. Ingo Harz ist deutscher Generalleutnant der Luftwaffe und seit 2018 der 16. Inspekteur der Luftwaffe. Inspekteur, das ist der Chef, das ist die Führung der deutschen Luftwaffe. Ja, also wir reden hier von den höchsten Vertretern der deutschen Luftwaffe, die sich getroffen haben. So, und die Frage ist, warum haben die sich denn getroffen? Die haben sich getroffen, um, wir werden es gleich hören, ein Gespräch mit Boris Pistorius vorzubereiten. Pistorius wollte ein bisschen tiefer einsteigen in das Thema Taurus. Das ganze Gespräch ist noch nicht alt, ist jetzt 12 Tage alt, vom 19. Februar, sagen die Russen, scheint inhaltlich hinzukommen. Und sie wollen da sich miteinander absprechen, was sie denn sagen, wie sie denn das ganze Thema Taurus vermitteln, mit dem Ziel, dass Taurus denn eingesetzt werden kann, wenn Olaf Scholz endlich seine Entscheidung ändert. So, und ich gehe durch diese 40-minütige Tonnachricht mit euch durch. Ich habe einige sehr interessante Stellen herausgesucht. Einmal, wie funktioniert so eine Tonnachricht? Wie ist die Grundstimmung? Die sind alle persönlich, privat miteinander bekannt offensichtlich. Und dann auch, was genau planen sie denn mit der Krim? Was hat denn die deutsche Bundeswehr damit zu tun, die Krimbrücke zu sprengen mit der Taurus etc.? So, dann hören wir mal ganz am Anfang rein, damit ihr erstmal einen Eindruck bekommt. Die Tonqualität ist nicht gut, deswegen hört bitte genau hin, aber ihr seid ja deutsche Muttersprachler, da brauche ich ja hier keine Untertitel machen, wie bei den englischen Videos. Anfang des Videos, los geht's. Das ist der Tonnachricht, los geht's.
Hallo. Moin moin, Herr General, Hauptmann Irgang hier. Servus. Ich würde Sie hinzufügen, wenn Sie möchten. Ja, na klar. Alles klar.
Sie treten nun der Konferenz bei.
Hallo. Ja, Hauptmann Irgang hier. Es ist jetzt dabei der General Gräfe, Oberstleutnant Florstedt und Oberstleutnant Fenske und wir warten noch 2-3 Minuten, dann wählen wir den Inspekteur dazu. Ja.
Und während sie auf ihren Chef, den Inspekteur, warten, reden sie noch ein bisschen über ihre Konferenz, die sie gerade hatten. Und dann erzählt der Gräfe, wie er gerade in Singapur ist. Das könnte bedeutend sein, manche haben spekuliert, dass es in Singapur abgefangen werden konnte, dieses Online-Meeting.
Ja. Ist Mittwoch auch dabei? Nee, also eigentlich wäre der Inspekteur ja gar nicht mit, wenn ich da gewesen wäre, dann hätte ich das gemacht. Aber ich bin ja gerade in Singapur. Ja, und hier ist es jetzt, hier ist es gerade 23:57 Uhr. Nice.
Nice.
Ja. It was a long day. Ich wollte heute zwischendrin, voll.
It was a long day. Das machen die ganze Zeit. Die hauen die ganze Zeit englische Floskeln rein. Schlimmer als jeder Teenager.
Nicht verärgern. Ich hätte heute mal kurz meine Kamera vom Fernseher hochheben sollen. Mit dem View, den man da aus meinem Hotelzimmer hat. Ich schicke dir vielleicht nachher mal ein Foto. Ja, mach mal. Bin ich schon gespannt. Ja, das ist schon mega. Hast du dieses Hotel mal gesehen? Da ist das nicht da mit den...
Also mega View hat der Frank Gräfe in Singapur, während sie noch warten auf den Generalleutnant Gerhards. Und dann sprechen sie noch über die Hotelbar, wie toll die ist in Singapur. So, und jetzt kommt der Gerhards bei Minute 5, kommt er rein und sagt auch gleich, was das Meeting soll, nämlich die Vorbereitung des Gespräches mit Pistorius, ihn zu, sagen wir mal, das ganze Thema Taurus noch ein bisschen schmackhafter zu machen. Also, Ingo Gerhards, Generalleutnant, Inspekteur der Deutschen Luftwaffe, er kommt.
Guten Tag zusammen. Gerhard hier, soweit ich weiß, haben wir den Kamerad Schäfer mit dabei, Kamerad Florstedt und Kamerad Fenske. Richtig? Genau. Jawohl. Alles klar. Wunderbar. Frank, du aus Singapur. Ja. Sehr gut, sehr gut. Ja, ich wollte mal einmal ganz kurz, dass wir uns vorher nicht im Sinne von wer was sagt, aber dass wir uns kurz mal so abstimmen und dass insbesondere auch hier die beiden Kamerad Florstedt und Fenske wissen, wie das Ganze entstanden ist. Weil wenn man hört, der Verteidigungsminister will mal wirklich tief in Taurus einsteigen, wobei der Termin ist eine halbe Stunde, so wie ich es gesehen habe. Also wir werden das Ding nicht zum Fliegen bringen können, um es mal so auszudrücken.
Wir werden das Ding nicht zum Fliegen bringen können. Der Ingo Gerhards übrigens, wie gesagt, Chef der deutschen Luftwaffe, sehr enger Freund von Israel, wurde von Israel bereits mehrfach ausgezeichnet. Er sieht seine ganze Bundeswehrmission in der Zusammenarbeit mit Israel, das nur nebenbei. Er möchte unbedingt, dass Taurus zum Einsatz kommt. Das wird im ganzen Gespräch klar, das ist ihm wirklich wichtig.
Ich sehe da im Moment dann nicht ein auslösendes Momentum dahinter. Also es ist nicht so, dass der Kanzler ihm gesagt hat, ey, mach dich da nochmal schlau und dann lass uns mal morgen entscheiden. Das habe ich jedenfalls nicht erkannt, sondern dass er nochmal Pistorius gesehen hat durch diese ganze Diskussion, die da immer und immer wieder kommt. Und Die kommt natürlich, weil keiner so richtig weiß, warum blockt der Kanzler hier, kommen natürlich abenteuerlichste Gerüchte auf.
Wieso blockt der Kanzler hier? Kann man überhaupt nicht verstehen. Also auch offensichtlich höchste Vertreter der Bundeswehr, Chef der Luftwaffe, kann es auch gar nicht verstehen. Und jetzt erzählt er von den abenteuerlichen Gerüchten, die da aufkommen.
Ich will mal eins nennen, ich bin gestern angerufen worden von einer Journalistin, die extrem nah am Kanzler dran ist. Ja, sie hätte in München gehört, der Taurus würde gar nicht funktionieren. Ich gesagt habe, okay, wer erzählt denn so eine Scheiße? Dachte, das hat jetzt irgendwie politisch aufgeschnappt. Da sagte, das hat mir jemand in Uniform erzählt. So, die gibt natürlich nicht ihre Quelle preis, völlig klar, aber ist natürlich voll drauf angesprungen und wollte da schon die mega Schlagzeile draus machen, nach dem Motto, jetzt haben wir endlich den Grund, warum der Kanzler nicht liefert, weil das Ding gar nicht funktioniert. Hier natürlich ausgeredet, totaler Schwachsinn. Ne? Wir machen da sogar alle naselang Verschusskampagnen. Die letzte ist noch nicht so ewig lange her. Ne? Aber man kann da mal sehen, was da mittlerweile immer für ein Gelaber im Raum ist und vor allen Dingen für ein Blödsinn erzählt wird. Ne? Ja. So, und da wollte ich eben mal ganz kurz mal nicht mit euch abstimmen, dass das da nicht in die falsche Richtung läuft.
So, soll nicht in die falsche Richtung laufen. Nicht, dass Pistorius den Eindruck bekommt, Taurus sollte gar nicht eingesetzt werden. Da haben nämlich der Generalleutnant eine ganz andere Meinung. So, ihr habt so ein bisschen den Eindruck jetzt, wie sie miteinander sprechen. Dann sprechen sie noch nebenbei ganz kurz über den Haushaltsausschuss und dass sie da jetzt hin müssen. Und die extreme Preissteigerung für die amerikanischen F-35, schon wieder Preissteigerung. Da gibt es seit Monaten Preissteigerung, dass sie das auch noch verkaufen müssen da, was auch nicht schön ist. Aber dann springen wir zur Visualisierung für Pistorius. Wie sollen sie ihm das denn vorstellen? Sie sollen ihn nicht zuballern mit Informationen. Ja, es wird richtig geplant, wie sie hier den Verteidigungsminister überzeugen können.
Lage reinversetzen.
Ihr sollt euch jetzt in seine Lage, also in Pistorius' Lage reinversetzen.
Wir haben ihm mal gezeigt bei so einer Demo-Show, da war da eine Taurus, stand da auf dem Waffen, auf dem Träger neben dem Tornado, aber zum Beispiel wie das angebaut aussieht am Tornado oder wie zum Beispiel so eine Missionsplanungsanlage aussieht, also der kann sich da sehr wenig vorstellen.
Okay. Udo, hast du bestimmt auch einen Haufen Slides zu, oder?
Ja, habe ich verfügbar.
Okay.
Ja, aber auf der anderen Seite jetzt auch nicht ihn zuballern mit einer Slideshow mit 30 Slides, einfach ein bisschen im Kopf haben, der Termin ist eine halbe Stunde. Ich würde mal sagen, so einen kurzen Aufschlag machen. Freuling wird sich ja hoffentlich nochmal melden. Klar geht es so ein bisschen auch um die Funktionsweise, was kann der Taurus?
Okay, also was erzählen wir Pistorius, was erzählen wir ihm nicht, aber das wird gleich noch interessanter, wenn sie über die Krim sprechen und wie sie das alles machen wollen. So, jetzt, wie lange dauert es eigentlich, Taurus aktiv einsetzen zu können, nachdem Scholz endlich die Zusage gemacht hat?
Zivile Opfer gibt. Deshalb sind das die beiden linke, rechte Grenze, zwischen denen man abwägen muss. Wenn man es mal runterbricht, die eine Bahn ist die Auslieferung der Flugkörper. Da haben wir eigentlich gar nichts mit zu tun. Und der wichtige Punkt wäre dann in dem Gespräch, muss man auch noch mal darauf hinweisen, ohne die Firma können wir gar nichts machen. Und es wäre dann schon ein Ziel, dass, wie es ja auch bei den Raketen von IRIS-T ist, dass man relativ zügig erste Flugkörper umrüstet und ausliefert. Aber da müssen halt dann so rudimentäre Sachen gemacht werden, nochmal eine kleine Überholung, das deutsche Hoheitsabzeichen runter und so. Aber das muss ja nicht dann warten, bis man 20 hat. Da könnte man theoretisch die ersten 5 abgeben. Also das wäre so die erste Bahn, die erste Linie, wie lange können die ausgeliefert werden. Aber das liegt eigentlich komplett in der Hand der Industrie. Und da stellt sich noch die Frage, wer bezahlt das, weil das ist ja mit Kosten verbunden. Die zweite Frage ist dann die Frage der Schnittstelle. Wie hängen wir das an welches Waffensystem dran? Und das ist jetzt wiederum auch eine Sache, die müsste dann eigentlich irgendein Bastler aus der Ukraine mit der Firma machen. Weil, oder, Herr Semke, oder da haben wir ja keine Aktien drin, wenn es um die Integration in eine SU zum Beispiel geht, oder?
Because you've called what Germany has been found to be planning an attack on the Crimea Bridge, which has happened several times before. Now it's regularly attacked during this conflict, whether through mysterious terrorist events or directly by Ukraine. And what was found, of course, was that Germany was planning to help Ukraine, not just with missiles, but with the planning of an attack on the bridge. There's also revelations that, British personnel are in Ukraine helping to do very similar things. So the significance of this, Scott, and what do you think the fallout will be from these developments moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing is in order to talk about this, you have to visualize, what it takes to get policy momentum. And the reason why I say that is, the United States took again, Victoria Nuland driven American policy, took a very aggressive stance on Ukraine at a time when, for instance, Emmanuel Macron was saying that he doesn't want Europe to be caught in a war between two superpowers, the United States and Russia. And he was talking about, the need for a European security framework that was sort of liberated from this American pressure. And so Macron was not somebody who was saying, we're going to send troops to Ukraine. He was the opposite, saying, we don't want to push for this conflict. Germany, look, Germany was like, we're happy with the energy. Keep it coming, keep it coming, keep it coming kind of thing. And, we'll work, we'll play stupid games with Minsk and all that, but we're not leaning forward for a conflict with Ukraine either. The United States is leaning forward very heavily. When you think about policy shifts, all that, imagine a giant ship, a container ship. To get it going, because there's a lot of weight, you have to point it in a direction, and then you have to slowly build up a head of steam. And once it gets going in the water, you ain't turning that thing around quickly. I mean, making major shifts it isn't easy. You have to move this mass, and you can move in incremental, but you're generally speaking to be going the same direction. So once you get foreign policy or national security policy together and moving, there's a mass. There's political mass. There's economic mass. There's domestic political. There's diplomatic, economic. All this is moving in one direction. Everything's working together. And so what the United States was doing for a couple of years was getting France and Germany to go from this direction and move them in this direction. And we finally got it. I mean, look, the Germans didn't want to send Leopard tanks. They didn't want to send Marder vehicles. Now they did. They didn't. The French didn't want to send the Caesar artillery. They did. We from 2022 to 2023, we got Europe in this direction with the counteroffensive, and they doubled down on that. They threw more coal into the engine, and off they went. This is the direction they're going. Ukrainian victory, because America's there leading the way. Meanwhile, America is sitting there going, this counteroffensive ain't working. Now they want F-16s. Holy cow. We're heading in a direction where, we're not going to win. This is going to be horrible. And so we started pulling back and slowing down our momentum. And then we start moving. Meanwhile, France and Germany are up doing this. And what's happened right now is that we have a situation where the French and the Germans are leaning way forward. So are the British, because we told them to lean way forward. They're doing things. The French and the British have been providing the British the Storm Shadow, the French the Scalp missile. These are air-delivered cruise missiles. They worked to get the Su-24s, which are a Soviet-era, fighter bomber. They got them modified so you can not only mount the missile, but you have the avionics inside linked up with the electronics to receive the intelligence package that comes in about where enemy air defense is, where their radars are. All that gets turned into a flight profile for the missile so it can go in and hit the target. And this flight profile is updated after the plane takes off. It'll go up and get a final update. That's why we have reconnaissance assets flying all over the place. And then they launch and they do attack plan. The people planning that attack plan and doing all the electronics aren't Ukrainian. They're British or they're French. And many of them are on the ground loading in the pre-stuff, making everything work. All the Ukrainians do is fly and hit some toggles and push a button. But all the other stuff is done by the French and the British. Why? They're leaning forward. That's their contribution. They're leaning forward. And these missiles are striking targets in Crimea, in addition to targets in the Russian rear area. The Germans have been pressured now to provide the Taurus missile. It supposedly has more capability, greater range than the Scalp or the Storm Shadow. But the Germans are running into a problem because, as you learned from listening to this tape, the Su-24 can't do it. It would have to be extensively modified, and then the Germans would have to put guys on the ground to do the same thing that the British and the French are doing on the ground, to serve as that middleman to get all the data loaded in, up running. You'd need a German team on the ground, and there's not supposed to be German troops on the ground there, so they don't want to have German troops on the ground. And then the Germans would have to be actively involved in targeting, and they talk about targeting. This isn't Ukrainians talking about taking down the Crimea Bridge. This is the Germans doing targeting of a Russian critical piece of Russian infrastructure. Now, there's a couple things here. Some people say that what's wrong with that, Scott? The Russians are bombing critical Ukrainian infrastructure. I mean, fair's play, right? If this was purely a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I guess you could say that. Fair's fair. But it's not. I don't think people remember or understand what's going on in NATO. For instance, if a Leopard tank breaks down, it's removed from Ukraine to Poland and sent probably to Lithuania, where there's a Leopard refitting facility where they repair the Leopard tank to bring it back into. Now, in normal warfare, that place would be bombed. It wouldn't exist anymore because it's participant in the conflict. In Poland, there's intelligence centers there where you have analysts coming together, or in Ramstein, they're doing the same thing. Logistics flows into Germany, into Polish warehouses on. In wartime, none of this would be allowed to exist. Russia would be hitting it. Ukraine is getting this huge benefit by having all of Europe to be this safe haven where their logistics, where they can train, where they can build weaponry, where stockpiles can be built up and all this stuff, and then filtered into Ukraine. But Russia can't attack that. So the idea of saying, no, it's a good thing to let Ukraine attack the Kerch Bridge. It's a bad thing to let Ukraine attack the Kerch Bridge, because what you're encouraging is war. And war means that Russia is going to attack all that stuff in NATO, and then we have a bigger problem. So I don't think people understand just how much of Russia's fighting this war with a hand tied behind its back, because it can't do the things that it would normally do to disrupt the flow of logistics and combat support that's coming from NATO, from the safe haven, into Ukraine. So we've got that. But then it's the Germans planning it. This isn't active aggression. Germany's not at war with Russia. They're not. I mean, they're participants in the conflict, apparently, but they're not at war. So what Germany's doing right now, and it's not me, and people are, Scott, you're just throwing words out there. I don't know. Saxony happens to be a German state, and the Saxon government has initiated Article 13 charges, which is basically the German constitution that prohibits people from engaging in acts, wars of aggression. Well, why are wars of aggression such a sensitive thing? I don't know. Maybe because the Nazis, they were Germans, by the way, in World War II, carried out a war of aggression against Europe and the Soviet Union. 27 million Soviets were killed. And when the war ended, I think it was Justice Jackson, American Supreme Court jurist who was a prosecutor at Nuremberg. He said the greatest crime, the greatest war crime of them all is a war of aggression, because from that, all other crimes take place. And German politicians, diplomats, and soldiers were hung by the neck until dead for committing the crime of a war of aggression. So the Germans rightfully said at the time, we don't ever want to be in that situation again. But here they are, 4 German officers planning a war of aggression against Russia, whom they're not at war with. Now, imagine meeting the Russians and getting this tape and listening to it, going, Now, the Russians, I think, nothing took them by surprise. First of all, I don't think this was Russian intelligence. I'll tell you why. I used to be in the intelligence business. And if I were able to successfully tap into the communications of 4 German Air Force officers who were giving away the farm, they gave away everything in this conversation. The last thing I'd want to do is compromise that. I'd want to say, I want to do this again and again And again, now that I know how to get in there, I want to repeat this. The other thing that happens is when you do something like this, you don't leave a sign that, Kilroy was here, the old World War II thing, apparently this was a WEX or something like that.
Yeah, it was a
thing.
very basic WebEx system. Yeah.
Yeah. But apparently, in addition to the 4 Germans, somebody else logged in and was hanging out there. And it was obvious there's somebody hanging out here who doesn't belong here. That's not how intelligence services work. You don't leave telltale signs. If you're in there and nobody knows about it, so that they speak freely. It just shows you the low level of communication security. Password 1234. A tough one, guys. Even I could break that one. So this happened. I think basically it wasn't Russian intelligence that did this. This was some sort of intelligence affiliated hacker, or because in Russia they do. We know this outside of in Moscow at various universities. There's groups of civilian hackers that are doing it sort of. Putin calls them Russian patriots, and they're supervised by intelligence guys who are interested in what successes have you had, what have you done, But it's not a Russian intelligence, because the Russian intelligence guys have their own tools, their own tradecraft, and they're not going to compromise that. They're not going to let these civilian hackers know. The civilian hackers are going and doing their own thing. And I think basically somebody was sitting there floating around and whatever and going, let's see, I'm in. They're letting me stay in. They're talking, record. Holy cow, look at what they're talking about. And it, from what I understand from Margarita Simeon, who's the editor-in-chief of RT, who received this and who published this, there's more of this. So I think that the Germans, and they say including Schultz, there's conversations that have been going on in this WebEx thing that this hacking group has gained access to, and she has access to. Russian intelligence would never give Margarita Simeon highly classified intelligence, because you burn the source. If this was Russian intelligence, we wouldn't know anything about it. The Russians are reticent. It's not like the United States that has a tradition of intelligence being leaked by politicians. I mean, you don't have to have a security clearance, ladies and gentlemen. Just read Washington, D.C. newspapers when something's happening, and you might as well have a top secret SCI clearance, because you're gaining access to top secret SCI information, because that's how America works. If you remember that leak when the stupid kid put all that stuff on the internet, he put it in Minecraft or something like that. He just pled guilty to the crime. That Massachusetts National Guard guy. Ladies and gentlemen, you read it. You had, for a while there, for a moment, a brief shiny moment, you had the highest security clearances in the land, because you were reading top secret code word material. And guess what? It's not that good. And in many cases, it's wrong, because it's the analysis derived from intelligence that was collected using top secret code word resources. It's not necessarily the information that's classified, it's how we gathered the information. And so if I'm the analyst and I'm gathering bits and pieces of information and I put it together in a product, and that product is crap, meaning that I got it all wrong, I didn't guess right, but there's facts in there, that's still going to be classified top secret code word. And so if you make the mistake of thinking, oh, because it's top secret code word, it has to be good, it has to be accurate, not really. Many times it's just pure unadulterated crap. As much of that stuff that the kid put out there was. But the Russians don't play that game. You don't see the Russians leaking top secret information. The Russians, I think, are pretty poor at information warfare in terms of trying to use the release of information to change policy. This leak by Margarita Simeon, however, is a deviation from that. It's genius, but I think it's because they got lucky enough to tap into a source of information that isn't protected by the security classifications of the real Russian intelligence service, and instead made their way so that by releasing it, you're not compromising anything. And it's embarrassing to the Germans. But you know, what the Germans did here was an act of war. Here's the other big thing about what the Germans did. Germany is supposed to be a democracy, and civil military relations is sort of what defines a democracy. You guys know the concept. The president is the civilian. He's the commander in chief. And if he orders a general to do something, the general does it. General can't say no unless it's an unlawful order. The general has to obey the orders. And the policy is made by the president, not by the generals. The generals advise on this. NATO, when we were talking about expanding NATO, you know, one of the key things that had to be driven into these former communist bloc nations is the notion of civilian control of the military, absolute civilian control of the military. Germany, when it unified, you know, had to be retrained in this, and supposedly they learned what they were, that was the case. But here we have a situation where the chancellor, who's the highest civilian executive of Germany, has said he doesn't support sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And the German parliament, sort of the ultimate expression of legislative authority in Germany, not once but twice, has voted overwhelmingly to reject sending the Taurus missile to Ukraine. So the civilian leadership has spoken. The executive and the legislative branch, there's no difference of opinion, no Taurus to Ukraine. So why do you have German officers who clearly state that they're acting with the knowledge of the defense minister, plotting an attack on the Crimea bridge using the Taurus missile, knowing that they would have to deploy it there and deploy secret people and all this stuff? Now you hear them saying, well, it isn't going to happen, it's unrealistic, going to be difficult, da-da-da. But why are they engaged in that to begin with? It's one thing for them to say, well, this is a contingency plan just in case they say, how do we get these missiles to Ukraine? But they weren't talking about how we get these missiles to Ukraine. They're talking about how do we use these missiles to attack Russia. That's Ukraine's business, not Germany's business. Germany has no business planning an attack against Russian infrastructure. That's an act of aggression. That's a war of aggression. And so what we're seeing here is a collapse of civil military institutions, civil military control in Germany. And this is very problematic. And we see something similar happening in France, I believe. I think that Macron likewise has seen the ship. You know, he's moved in this direction, and he's committed to this, and committed to the concept of a Ukrainian victory over Russia. And he's looking around, and it isn't happening. So he's basically telling Europe, you got to grow a pair. Sorry to go that direction. You have to, man up and do something. You're cowards if you don't want to deploy your troops to Ukraine. He's talking about deploying not NATO troops, but troops from NATO nations who are entering into, their own unilateral security agreements with Ukraine, to send troops there to relieve Ukrainian troops who are currently not on the front lines, maybe guarding the Belarusian border, maybe digging in around Kiev, to release them to go to the front line, because Ukraine has a manpower emergency right now. Zelensky has just come out and said we're 700,000 men short. Where'd they go? I don't know. They're all dead, but they're 700,000 men short. And they only have 200 to 300,000 men available for the front lines right now, and that's not enough. And they're losing men at thousands a day right now, and and they've got nothing to hold the Russians back. So they need manpower right now. And so Macron, having moved his ship into the ship of states, moving in this direction, all that momentum, Macron doesn't want to hit the brakes or turn around, because that makes France look bad. So Macron is saying, in order to maintain this momentum, we have to do something that keeps Ukraine viable. Ukraine needs manpower. That's their number one pressing issue right now, manpower over everything else. And the easiest way to get manpower is to basically put foreign troops in to, not in a frontline combat capacity, but in a rear area support capacity, to relieve Ukrainian troops who can then go to the front lines. The irony is, all you're going to get out of that is 60,000 troops. You're not going to get any more than that. But that's better than nothing. That buys time to, maybe Ukraine can come up with a magic mobilization scheme, which they can't do. But Macron is committed to this. And so the French ship is moving, the German ship is moving, the American ship has stopped. And America now, literally, we're in a situation where our national security has been hijacked by France and Germany, because they're doing things that if they are implemented, commit us to a war that we don't want to fight. And the other thing about this is the American people understand we do have something called the Constitution. Congress is the only body capable of declaring a war. We're not at war with Russia right now. We're going to be at war if France keeps doing what they're doing and Germany keeps doing what they're doing. We're going to be at war, but it's a war that hasn't been discussed by Congress. Has Congress voted on this to declare war? The President of the United States, of course, can commit American troops under the War Powers Act, but only in a situation where we've been attacked and it's a pressing issue, and he doesn't have time to notify Congress. But has the president said this is what we want? We want to support this? No, the president's saying the exact opposite. We don't want a war. We don't want American troops there. But the American people are ignorant of this, and we're going to wake up one day thinking that, well, it's okay, there can't be a war with Russia because Congress hasn't declared war and the president isn't articulating warlike. In fact, he just fired Victoria Nuland. So clearly we're not going to war with Russia. We're going to go to war with Russia if France and Germany keep going in this direction because it's inevitable. And that means that we've allowed foreign entities to hijack congressional processes, constitutional processes. This is a very dangerous situation for America, for Americans, for the world, to be honest. But I don't think most Americans understand how bad things are. You should be calling your representatives, your senators, and demanding that there are hearings about the potential of war with Russia. And is this what we want? Do we want a war with Russia? Because that's what we're getting. And if we don't want a war with Russia, what are we doing to distance ourselves from French actions and German actions? If I were the president of the United States, I'd be calling up Emmanuel Macron and saying, we won't support you. If you put troops in there, we will publicly distance ourselves from you. And we'll tell the Russians that there will be no Article 5 protection for not only the French troops on the soil in Ukraine, but for France. Meaning that if you take this decision, that means that France is now at war with Russia and you're on your own. You get no NATO protection. Russia, you're free to just take them out. We don't like them anyways. Germany, the same thing. Sorry, Germany, but if you put the Taurus missile in there and you attack the Crimea Bridge, you're at war with Russia. We're not. You don't get Article 5 protection. We're not riding to your rescue, and Russia has permission to destroy you. We need to do something like that to put these two nations on notice, indeed to put all of NATO on notice that there will be no war with Russia. The only way there's a war with Russia if Russia attacks NATO, and we should make this very clear. When it's therefore we need Secretary of Defense Austin to stop saying that if we don't win in Ukraine, there will be a war with Russia.
Yep.
Well, there won't be unless Russia attacks NATO, which Russia isn't going to do. So what Austin should be saying is we need to bring an end to this Ukrainian conflict so that there's no risk of Russia attacking NATO. But Russia is not going to attack NATO. It's an artificial thing. But if we continue to lean forward like that, remember, what lean forward means that we're getting NATO to create domestic, political, diplomatic, economic, and national security momentum. That's very difficult to turn around. We need to bring these giant container ships to a halt, and then we need to slowly turn them and move away from the direction of war.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure
and additional funding from the U.S. has stalled, which means the war-torn country could run into trouble within months.
Ukraine needs broad spectrum of aid, military support, continuously.
There's been a wide range of military assistance that's been provided to Ukraine, things ranging from vehicles, missiles, air defense systems.
Here's where U.S. aid to Ukraine has gone so far, and what could happen if additional funding remains stalled. Since 2022, Congress has directed more than $113 billion in aid in 4 packages to Ukraine.
Aid to Ukraine is a misnomer. The phrase implies that all of the money is going to Ukraine, but in fact about 60% of it is spent in the United States.
More than half of the appropriated aid is allocated for U.S. military operations and weapons contracts, including U.S. military equipment to replace what was sent to Ukraine, weapons contracts and services, and additional U.S. forces in Europe to support NATO. The non-defense spending includes humanitarian assistance to help the more than 6 million Ukrainian refugees and relieve global economic disruption.
And costs about high-end threats. It makes no point to shoot a $4 million missile. $60 billion of military aid when you consider all the different elements of it.
On that long list of equipment, there have been a range of weapons, including Javelin anti-armor systems, which are smaller arms designed to hit and destroy heavily armored military vehicles.
Javelin is a top-of-the-line anti-tank weapon and costs about $200,000 when you include the launcher unit.
Long-range rocket launchers, also known as HIMARS.
They cost about $7 million per launcher.
The M1 Abrams tank.
The M1 tanks cost about $14 million apiece to replace.
And the Patriot air defense system.
The United States provided one battery, which costs about $400 million. So because of the cost, they can only be used against high-end threats. It makes no point to shoot a $4 million missile at a $20,000 drone.
When we do oversight, we try to identify the areas where we can have the maximum impact. One very big line of effort, if you will, looks at the equipment, really starting throughout its life cycle, from when it's first sourced to make sure there's accountability once it goes into the country.
According to a Defense Department report released in January, as of June 2023, $1 billion worth of sensitive equipment shipped to Ukraine remained delinquent or not properly tracked in accordance with the strict requirements for tracking certain military items.
Of diversion of the equipment that's been provided to Ukraine.
From the onset of the war, Congress has embraced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's resiliency against Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking.
But by 2023, Ukraine's efforts to repel Russian forces failed to make significant progress. This coincided with a political shift in the U.S. House of Representatives from Democratic to Republican control.
You have Republicans in charge of the House, and of course, Republicans, that segment of the country is the exact area where support for Ukraine is starting to erode.
There's an interview that they conducted with the deputy head of the Duma, which is the Russian parliament. And I must say his French is exemplary. It's very, very good. He speaks almost, perfectly like a native. And I'm going to translate what's being said. It is unbelievable. Honestly, unbelievable. Okay, hold on. Let's go.
On s'en fout de son opinion. Vous vous foutez de ce que dit Emmanuel Macron? On s'en fout de son opinion.
We do not care about his opinion. He's talking about Macron.
Vous vous foutez de ce que dit Emmanuel Macron? Exact.
And then the journalist says, you don't care. You don't give a crap about what Emmanuel Macron is saying. And he says, yes, exactly.
Exactement. Et quand il vous dit qu'il est prêt, éventuellement, à ne pas se fixer de limites. On s'en fout de ces...
And then when he says, the journalist asks him, and when Emmanuel Macron, the French president, says that he is ready to, basically... about the war in Ukraine to just get rid of all kinds of limits or caps and just go all out, Basically, it's a threat. He says, we do not care. We literally do not care.
Des limites. On s'en fout de Macron, de ce qu'il dit Macron. On s'en fout des limites de Macron.
We do not care about Macron's limits. We do not give a crap about Macron. We do not care about what Emmanuel Macron says.
Macron, et on va tuer. La France reste une puissance nucléaire.
And then he says, the journalist says, but France is a nuclear power.
Tout à fait, avec 200 missiles.
And then he says, yeah, with about 200 missiles. Remember that the Russians, I think, have the largest number of nuclear missiles. They certainly have the best in the world.
Et donc, on va tuer tous les soldats français qui vont venir au sol ukrainien.
We will kill every French soldier that comes to Ukraine. That's what he said.
Tous.
Every single one.
Aujourd'hui, il y en a durant le conflit en Ukraine.
Because right now in this Ukraine war,
13 000 mercenaires.
There are 13,000 mercenaries.
Dont 367.
Of which 367 And 67
Français,
are French. 367 are French citizens,
et dont 147 ont déjà tué.
and of which 147 have already been killed.
Donc il y en a 147 citoyens de la France qui ont été tués en Ukraine.
So there are 147 French citizens who have been killed in Russia, in Ukraine.
En opinion, et tout le monde, ont déjà tué. Donc il y en a 147 citoyens de la France qui ont été tués en Ukraine. Et on va tuer tout le monde.
And we're going to kill everybody.
Vous inquiétez pas.
Do not worry.
Ouais.
Make no mistake.
Il menace de tuer tout le monde et il donne donc aussi des chiffres inédits qu'on n'avait pas. Il affirme qu'il y a 13
that journalist was like, he couldn't say a thing. Even these two, they don't know what to say. They're just like, yeah, they're talking about the figures basically that he
000
cited.
mercenaires. Parmi ces mercenaires, 367 Français et 147 d'entre ces Français qui auraient été tués. Voilà, Patrick Sauce sera avec nous.
A lot of people think this war started in 2022. Do you agree with that, or should we really be saying 2014? Around then.
This war began in 2014, plain and simple. This is a war of Ukrainian nationalist aggression against ethnic Russians in Ukraine. That's what this war is. The Ukrainian nationalists, the right sector, and others of their ilk seized control of what was, prior to February 2014, a peaceful demonstration against the government of Viktor Yanukovych over economic policies. His refusal to move towards the European Union and instead seek closer economic ties with Moscow. People exercise their right in a democracy to peacefully assemble and protest. But it wasn't until, I think, February that these protests turned violent because they were hijacked by Ukrainian nationalists who, under direction of the United States and the European Union, undertook what is tantamount to a coup d'etat, violently overthrowing the legitimately elected, democratically elected president of Ukraine and replacing it with a government that was handpicked by the United States. It's not democracy that took place. The United States orchestrated a coup. Victoria Nuland in the intercepted phone call, our boy Yats, speaking of the man who went on to become the prime minister of Ukraine. They were talking about different Ukrainian parliamentarians whom the United States had bought off. So we put in place a government that owed its position to the violence perpetrated by these neo-Nazis, even though people say, well, they were a minority. When the Bolsheviks were a minority, but they were the most violent, of the revolutionaries in the Russian Revolution. They beat out the Mensheviks. Mensheviks small, but they're actually bigger. But the Bolsheviks big, beat them out. Yeah. They beat out the social revolutionaries. They beat out Kerensky. They beat out everybody, and they seized power. And these neo-Nazi right-wing affiliated people were able to leverage violence, political violence, and real violence into being the dominant force in Ukraine. And it's not me saying this. There's videotapes of their own leaders bragging about this, saying that you can't be a minority when you're the one holding the power. And these are the people that went into Odessa, terrorized the ethnic Russians, stuffed 150 of them into the trade union building, set it on fire, killing nearly 50 of them, beating others. And then they moved into the Donbass. And their seizure of Mariupol, has been ignored by the West, what they did in taking over Mariupol, the rape, the murder, the terrorism that was perpetrated against ethnic Russians in Mariupol. There's a reason why the Kharkov soccer club transformed itself into the Azov Regiment. Azov being named after the Sea of Azov, Mariupol located on that. When they seized Mariupol, they made that their headquarters. Yeah. And they made the suppression, the genocide, the murder of ethnic Russians their mission. And they did that mission from 2014 until 2022. They did it with a vengeance. And then they moved into all of Donbass. And this led to the ethnic Russians rising up and saying, we're not going to let this happen. And then we have the situation we have. And there was a war between 14 and 16,000 people were killed from 2014 to 2022, horrible. Ignored by the West. I'm not saying there's, all the devils were on the one side and all the angels are on the other side. I'm not saying that. War brings out the worst in people, and I'm sure that there were atrocities committed by ethnic Russians because, again, you saw this in Yugoslavia. I mean, how do you have a situation like Sarajevo where Serbs, Croats, Muslims are living side by side in peace for decades, and suddenly overnight, all they want to do is slit each other's throat and murder women, rape women, murder kids. How do you make that transition? It's a psychological thing that happens. It's based on hate. And so there was real hatred between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But the Ukrainians, it wasn't Denis Pushilin who went on TV and said, every Ukrainian child is going to spend their life in a basement afraid of the shelling. That was Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, that said this. And now we know that, the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to bring about peace, originally negotiated in 2014, Minsk II came in 2015 as part of the Normandy format. The Ukrainian government said that they would be part of this, but they refused to get it ratified. Why? One, because the Nazis said if you ratify it, we'll kill you. So Poroshenko was told, we'll kill you. And then Zelensky was told, we'll kill you. So you couldn't do that. Then we found out that even that was just a game. Poroshenko was admitted. We never planned on implementing Minsk. It was always a sham.
Понимаем, что Россия не собирается воевать с Европой. Да мы и сейчас не собираемся. Вот руководство Соединенных Штатов говорит, вот если и НАТО, вот если сейчас на Украине, значит, Россия победит, следующая страна НАТО. Да зачем нам эти страны НАТО? Они нам не нужны никогда. Не были нужны, и сейчас не нужны, и в будущем нужны не будут. Они специально втащили нас и Европу в этот конфликт. Добились в этом смысле своей цели. Растащили Россию и Европу. А сейчас перекладывают на Европу еще и бремя финансовой ответственности и платежей. Ведущие индустриальные экономики Европы в минусе. Они ушли в рецессию. Но и в политическом сознании многих народов Европы происходят изменения. Но они видят, что Соединенные Штаты нагло, беспощадно эксплуатируют Европу в своих интересах. А те страны, которые потеряли эти территории, и прежде всего Польша, спят и видят вернуть. В этом смысле только Россия могла быть гарантом территориальной целостности Украины. Не хотят? Не надо. История все расставит на свои места. Мы мешать не будем, но свою не отдадим. Вот что все должны понять. И в Украине те, кто агрессивно настроен в отношении России.
Мы всегда будем верны делу, за которое отдали свои жизни наши боевые товарищи.
There's no amount of military assistance, weapons, money that can be brought in that's going to change this outcome.
In the tumultuous landscape of modern geopolitics, few conflicts have captured the world's attention and concern as profoundly as the war between Ukraine and Russia. Against the backdrop of territorial disputes, political maneuvering, and historical animosities, the conflict has been marked by a barrage of information, misinformation, and disinformation. Amidst this fog of war, Scott Ritter, a former United Nations weapons inspector turned whistleblower, has emerged as a voice seeking to pierce through the veil of propaganda and reveal the stark realities of the situation. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Ritter's insights into the conflict stem from his deep knowledge of weapons systems and his experiences as a weapons inspector in Iraq during the 1990s. His journey from serving as a military intelligence officer in the Gulf War to becoming a vocal critic of U.S. foreign policy has shaped his perspective on international affairs. With a keen eye for detail and a commitment to truth-telling, Ritter has undertaken the daunting task of unraveling the complexities of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. At the heart of Ritter's revelations lies a fundamental understanding of the geopolitical dynamics that have fueled the conflict. Contrary to the simplistic narratives often presented in mainstream media, Ritter argues that the roots of the conflict extend far beyond mere territorial disputes. Instead, he delves into the historical, cultural, and strategic factors that have shaped the antagonistic relationship between Ukraine and Russia. One of the central pillars of Ritter's analysis is the role of external actors in exacerbating tensions between Ukraine and Russia. He contends that Western powers, particularly the United States and its European allies, have played a significant role in stoking the flames of conflict through their support for Ukraine's pro-Western government. From providing financial assistance and military aid to engaging in provocative military maneuvers in the region, Ritter argues that Western powers have contributed to the escalation of hostilities. Ritter sheds light on the presence of far-right elements within Ukraine's political landscape, whose extremist rhetoric and actions have further inflamed tensions with Russia. He points to the rise of ultra-nationalist militias and the glorification of World War II-era Ukrainian nationalist figures as evidence of the dangerous ideological currents coursing through Ukrainian society. By highlighting the role of these actors, Ritter challenges the simplistic narrative of Ukraine as a besieged democracy fighting against Russian aggression. In addition to external actors, Ritter also examines the internal dynamics driving the conflict within Ukraine itself. He underscores the deep divisions within Ukrainian society.
You see what Western leaders have been ad nauseum repeating since that time. You can understand why people actually do in the West believe that Russia's attack was unprovoked. And of course, it's really important to ascertain how this war actually started and was there a provocation, because that leads into the current narrative that so many in the West are trying to funnel, and that is that the Russians, if they are not stopped in Ukraine, are going to keep going. So if you believe that the war was unprovoked, then you may also believe that, yeah, and Putin will keep going. The Baltics will be next. Poland will be next, something like that. So let's delve in to find out what actually did happen in the year or so, especially, and even more than that, before the war broke out in February of 2022. You may be surprised by some of what you find out. And these folks are things that are facts. These are not subject questions that we have or theories or whatever. This is rooted in things that actually happened. And when you see coming out of the very mouths of some of the people that were engaged at the time, it'll give you a new perspective on this war and especially on where it may go from here. And literally, there is no one better to talk about this than Colonel Jacques Baud. We had him on a week or so ago. And in fact, some of the things he said during that time just really opened my eyes that I couldn't wait to have him back to talk more on that issue about the origins. And we do have him back today. So Colonel, welcome back to the show. Really glad to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be back with you. That's nice to invite me. I'm looking forward for this show.
Yeah, and so people, I recommend just go to Amazon and Google your name under the title, because a lot of the books that you've written and for sure refer to them as we go through here, because I know a lot of the things are covered in detail in some of your books for anybody who wants to go deeper. But we're going to jump right into it. So I want to just kind of show you in this compact little clip here that Gary put together, how people have been relentlessly saying, Western leaders from the beginning, how this is unprovoked and unjustified.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine without provocation, without justification.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an unprovoked war of aggression.
Russia's unprovoked, unwarranted war on Ukraine has kicked off a humanitarian crisis.
We are united in condemning the Kremlin's unprovoked aggression.
Це злочинна та неспровокована агресія Росії проти нашої нації.
Ukraine is facing a barbaric, unprovoked military assault.
Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy.
We are not going to boost any security agreements or start any security agreements with the government of Russia, a government that we have seen invade one of its neighbors unprovoked.
So, according to the president on his State of the Union address a week or so after the invasion happened, the Russian attack was unprovoked. It was premeditated, and he is, going to continue on until he conquers all of Ukraine. And as we find out, it wasn't quite that clear cut that it was unprovoked, because the way it's being characterized, Colonel, is that basically Russia's just one day Putin woke up and said, you know what? Let's go get them. Let's just take off in there. Ukraine was sitting there and They wouldn't do anything, and all of a sudden, here comes these tanks. Not quite the way it was it?
Absolutely. In fact, this war was, let's say, planned, I could say, by the West and even by the Ukrainians themselves. And here we have to be careful. As a preliminary remark, we have to make a distinction between the reason why Russia entered Ukraine and, on the other hand, the objectives that Russia will be seeking through that opportunity, I would say. But the West created that opportunity. And in fact, we have to go back a little bit to the Maidan issue, because even there, a lot of people don't understand what happened. And that's the root causes of everything that happened later. So what happened just before Maidan? In 2012, 2013, Ukraine was contemplating the idea of joining the EU. And the idea was, of course, to have an economic tie between Ukraine and EU. But there was a big problem with that. And the problem is that during the Cold War, Ukraine was, as you know, part of the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, I make the story short, but in the Soviet Union, every single republic had a kind of division of labor with Russia. Meaning that you had, as an example, for instance, to produce Russian or Soviet fighters, the engines were produced in Ukraine. But the engines produced in Ukraine could be used only in Soviet fighters, could not be used in Western fighters. And after the war, Ukraine continued to have these economic and industrial relationship with Russia. By entering into EU and redirecting the whole economy towards EU, that had a problem because the Ukrainian industry was not suited for the European market. Therefore, the Ukrainian...
I'm sorry. So even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the division of labor, relatively say, continued on. So Ukraine was still making stuff that only Ukraine was making that was needed for the Russian army. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Yeah. That's in essence, this is the idea. And as the Ukrainian identified this problem, they entered contact with Russia and asked if we could have some kind of arrangement that would allow Ukraine to join EU while maintaining the same kind of relationship with Russia. And Russia said, okay, we can have a kind of tripartite agreement so that you have a kind of a free trade agreement with EU, and you keep the existing arrangement with Russia. So that would include more or less Russia in some kind of free trade with Ukraine, and Ukraine free trade with EU. And
that would seem to be a really good thing for Ukraine, because it would expand their economic opportunities, not redirect it or shift it, but actually expand it to include potentially both, right?
Absolutely. And that was the idea. The problem is that the European Union refused that. Manuel José Barroso, who used to be the predecessor of Ursula von der Leyen, said, no, there's no way. It's either EU or Russia. It's not and, it's or, period. And hence, the discussions, the negotiations that were already ongoing on this issue had to be paused, because that was a problem that has to be solved by the Ukrainian leadership. And so President Yanukovych asked for a pause, not for a stop, but a pause. The problem is that in the West, we represented, or we advertised, so to say, this pause as a stop. And that triggered a first Maidan protest, which was very peaceful at the beginning. That was just citizens asking for continuing the discussion with the EU and so on and so forth. But that was very peaceful. Problem is that the US, and namely, again, to make things short, Victoria Nuland, who was in charge with the issue of Ukraine, saw here an opportunity to create a situation that would harm Russia. And hence started a second phase of Maidan, where you had literally agent provocateurs. They were sent to Kiev and started a violent uprising against President Yanukovych. And we know that they were agent provocateurs. You may remember that during these protests, you had protesters being shot, allegedly by the government. Well, last year, Ukrainian court acknowledged that these protesters who were shot were shot by agent provocateurs and not by the government.
Really? The Ukrainian government recognized it.
It's a court in Vinnytsia, if I'm not wrong. So we know today that the whole issue was literally provoked, and the situation was deliberately set on fire in order to provoke the withdrawal of Yanukovych. And in fact, what happened on the 21st of February 2014, that the protesters signed an agreement with Yanukovych in order to organize new elections and having a change, in fact, in the government. And interestingly enough, France and Germany were the guarantors of this first agreement. But 2 days later, Yanukovych was ousted of the government, and in fact, he was toppled, and a new government, an unelected government, came into power.
Yeah.
And here came the very first start of the Donbass issue, because the very first law that those new people who came to the power, they were ultranationalists. They came from Lvov, not from Kiev. This is also important to say. These are Westerners, in fact, Western Ukrainians. And their first action was, in fact, to abolish the law that made Russian an official language. In fact, in Ukraine so far, you had several languages, because there are several minorities, including the Hungarian minority, Romanian minority, and so on and so forth. And the Russian and Ukrainian, since there was the most spoken languages, both were official language, meaning that you could address your administration either in Ukrainian or in Russian. Even at school, the two languages were equally taught at students, and so on and so forth. But by abolishing that law, that meant that only Ukrainian was the official language, and Russian was just a usual language to be used at home, but not in business with the government. And that triggered a huge amount of protests in the whole Ukraine. And maybe I can show you, probably, if I can make it, I will try to show you the map of these. I don't know if you see the map.
Yeah, I can see it.
The mass of the protests that erupted just after this decision. And you can see that the whole southern part of Ukraine, just flared up. And of course, this is the number of locations where you had protests. And you see that the number were very strong in the Donbass area, very strong in the Odessa area, and of course Crimea. And but that's exactly what happened. The whole country fired up. And that's
so everything in that on that screen, everything in the gray area, there was not a lot of protest because they were okay with the Russian language being taken away, but everything in the red protest.
These are mostly Ukrainians, Russian-speaking areas, and in the rest of Ukraine, this is mostly Ukrainian-speaking area. That's why you see this difference. But you see, for instance, that in Kiev itself, you had protests because obviously in the capital, you have both languages equally represented. But that's very much what the situation that happened in after Maidan. The problem is that in order to cope with that situation, the government, the new government, had to send the army, and they started to send the army, but this was not very effective